Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the AM/PM podcast. It's been a while. My name is Manny Coates, and I will be your host, and this is the show where we discuss all things Amazon private label and how to generate recurring revenue streams 24 hours per day during the AM and the PM, hence the name of the show. Get it? AM/PM podcast. As a matter of fact, this weekend I was in the mood to do something big. So I called up my friend Tim Jordan. We came up with a plan that we're going to be sharing with you on the next episode of the podcast. And while all of this was happening, I was making money. But I wasn't the only one making money. Tim was too. How cool is that? Pretty cool, I think. Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the AM/PM podcast. My name is Manny Coates. I'm here with my good buddy, Tim Jordan. Tim, how you doing?
I'm doing good.
So this is a really, really special episode. There's massive changes coming to this. If you've been following me for a while, if you have been a listener of AM/PM podcast from the beginning, you know a lot about who I am. But I know that I've been out of this for a while. It's been over a year since I've actually done a podcast. Tim is going to be the new host of the AM/PM podcast. Tim has been a guy that I've known for a long time, amazing entrepreneur. I had him on the podcast a long time ago, actually. Was it your first podcast that you ever did, ever?
Yep, we'll talk about that later, but yes.
Okay, cool. So, so he is the obvious choice to come in and take this thing over. The guy he knows everybody in the industry. He's full of knowledge. I think you guys are going to be taken care of better than anybody else I could imagine. So we got close to 200 episodes when I was doing it. And from this point on, you're going to be carrying that torch.
Yeah, and it's pretty crazy. I know a lot of people have been asking, what happened to the AM/PM podcast and what happened to the AM/PM podcast, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. And we know that as you kind of stopped doing the podcast, we got into the SSP podcast with Bradley Sutton, the Serious Seller podcast, and that was carrying a lot of weight for new episodes and new content coming out from the Helium 10 bubble, so to speak. But AM/PM never disappeared. I've heard people still talking about it. People still listening. It's still out there.
Yeah. It still has a ton of listens. I was going to say views, but yeah, absolutely. About the same time that the AM/PM podcast stopped releasing episodes, you'll notice, or people will notice that's when the Serious Sellers podcast took off, and that was done very purposely. At that time, the story obviously is that when I started AM/PM podcast. Shortly thereafter, we were getting into Helium 10, started to build Helium 10. And a lot of the episodes of the podcast, a lot of the questions, a lot of the topics that we were going through had to do with the software. And it started to feel a little weird to me. I was like, we started this journey about following my journey on selling on Amazon, and I was talking about that, but then it started shifting a lot towards Helium 10, and it just felt a little strange. So we wanted to start a podcast where it was very clear from the beginning that, hey, this is a podcast by Helium 10, and we're going to be talking about Helium 10 a lot, and there's not going to be any surprises. Whereas the AM/PM podcast, we were trying to figure out what direction we wanted to go with that, and it just we never got back to it because we got so busy. And we're going to talk about what happened and why we got so busy. But yeah, Serious Sellers podcast. If you guys want to check that out, by the way, Bradley Sutton's an awesome host over there. I think the link, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's helium10.com/subscribe. And that'll take you right to to the page to subscribe to that podcast, or you can go to iTunes or I'm not even sure the other ones where you can actually just type in Serious Sellers and you'll see it.
Well, now that the headline is back, that AM/PM is back, and the headline is out there, which is kind of exciting. I know for a lot of you that are listening, it's been hyped up over the last week or maybe even 2 weeks because a lot of you are longtime listeners and a lot of you are brand new listeners. Even though there hasn't been a new episode, we're still getting brand new subscribers to AM/PM. And I think that, kind of as I take over hosting it, which is a huge honor to me. I'll say that. When I was invited to do this, I was like shocked, silent. Bojan, brought it up to me and I was silent. And he said, I guess that means you're not interested. And in reality, I was sitting here going, oh my gosh, they just asked me to take over AM/PM podcast. It's like a huge honor. But as we move into more about me a little later on this episode and more of what's going to happen with AM/PM and what we're going to kind of turn this thing into, I want to find out more about the origination, Manny, not just of you, but also of the AM/PM podcast. right?
Sure,
So
sure.
a lot of people haven't heard the history, but it was obviously very instrumental in changing your life. It was actually instrumental in changing a lot of people's lives. I could start naming off names of people that an appearance or something they heard on the AMPM podcast made them a better entrepreneur, a better seller. It got them some exposure if they were some sort of service fighter. It's really been a lot bigger, maybe even, Mandy, than you realize for a lot of us that got started in the industry a little bit later than you. So tell me, like, why did you start the AMPM podcast? When did you start it? What was the purpose for it? Give me like the 5-minute, this is the birth of AMPM.
It all started back at the end of 2015, December of 2015. And my business partner, co-founder, Guillermo Puyol, and I he was the one who actually told me about Amazon. And he was talking about arbitrage. And I was thinking, man, that's just a grind. That's going to be crazy. It doesn't sound like something I'd want to get into. He mentioned there was a more expensive way of doing things called private label. I started looking into it and then very quickly was fascinated and said, you know what, I'm going to do this. As people started subscribing and I was getting a lot of feedback, I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. You know what, I'm going to continue this thing. I'm going to chronicle everything that I'm doing in this Amazon FBA private label journey, the good and the bad, because one of the things I noticed, and you probably have noticed this too, is a lot of the podcasts out there, a lot of the people that are training stuff, it sounds like their life is perfect. Like they've never had any downs. Everything's awesome. It's super easy to make money. And I was just like, you know what? I'm going to talk about the bad stuff. And that was probably some of the very first episodes was like, I made this mistake and oh my God, I just got screwed over here and this was bad and blah, blah, blah. Right. And people were really liking that, like, oh my God, I did that same thing, and I thought it was just terrible. And I didn't know about that. For example, I think on one of the very early podcasts, I was talking about I don't even know if they have this anymore, but they had the Amazon drop test, right? The 3-foot drop test.
Yep.
And I remember going on, after I had my product in my living room, I'm like, oh, there's this 3-foot drop test. I remember dropping it. And they were, my product was, liquid chalk markers. And I remember dropping this, I think it was an 8-pack or something, and I dropped it and the box just exploded everywhere and pens went everywhere. And I'm like, okay, that didn't survive the first test. So we had to like put all these little plastic sealers on them and stuff. So, and I know you gave me 5 minutes. I'm gonna try to go through this a little quicker, but basically, as the months progressed, I started creating some software for myself to kind of make things a little bit easier. There just wasn't a lot of cool tools out there in the Amazon space. And I was talking about those on the podcast. Those tools would eventually lead to become Helium 10. Started off with just a few tools. And then, eventually we're running the podcast, running Helium 10. And podcast just kept growing in popularity. And that's kind of the short of it. There's a lot of really cool stories in between with everything that happened. The podcast then led to us throwing some events. We had some really crazy events in other countries, and it was really cool.
Yeah, and that's interesting because most people in this e-commerce space that have a tool and have some sort of content, they start with a tool and they use the content as the marketing piece, for the tool. So, I have, X service, I'm going to go out and start a podcast, right? But you were kind of backwards. You started the podcast just to kind of chronicle your journey, and to fill a need, you created tools, which became Helium 10. And then, your journey, which was chronicled through the podcast, led to, a pretty large following jumping into this Helium 10 thing. And it kind of snowballed, but it's a little different than where a lot of people start their content. You know what I mean? Or maybe
and ours was even, you probably don't even know this, but when we started the podcast, I think the first 2 tools that we created, one was Scribbles. What was the second one? It wasn't 5K Checker, because that's when we transitioned to actually paying. But the first 2 tools were actually lead magnets on the website to get people to actually subscribe to the podcast. So like, hey, if you would subscribe to the podcast, we'll allow you to use these tools. So completely reverse, right?
Wow.
This is really wacky. So, and it worked. Awesome. I mean, it was good. And then finally, when we had 3 tools, Frankenstein was the other one. Yeah. So we had Scribbles and Frankenstein. And then when we added 5K Checker, that's when we were talking about indexing, right? Nobody was talking about indexing on Amazon yet. I think we originated that phrase. I don't want to take credit for it, but I think it wasn't really being used before then. You can fact check that.
I'm writing this down. Quote, Manny, I haven't said Amy. Manny claims he coined the phrase indexing.
For the specific Amazon, because we were using that term, I think in the Apple ecosphere when we were doing mobile games, because it was very similar. We came from that space, right? And so when you're creating a mobile app, it was very, very similar to the Amazon side, because you had an icon, right? Once people are doing searches, your icon has to grab them. Well, it's the same thing. You have your first thumbnail, your image on Amazon. You had your titles, you had your keywords, you had your description, all the same. But we knew how to rank on Apple, on the Apple side, ASO, right? Apple App Store optimization versus Amazon. It was really good. And then that led to, we did, my goal was $250,000 in sales on Amazon my first year. That would have my first full year, which would have been 2016. We only had 1 month in 2015, December. And we did 1.6 million in sales. And I think that, Tim, was what kind of catapulted like everything at once, because we're like, holy crap, this guy has a podcast and he has some software and he did 1.6 million. So he must be legit. But I did talk about all the failures and I talked about all the stuff. So it kind of,
that's what made you legit. That legitimatized you. Is that the right word?
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
It sounds good to me. Yeah, but and you're right. And I will say this, you kind of got a little bit of a what's the word we're looking for? A reputation for calling it like it is. You know, there's a lot of people out there we won't even talk about Amazon. Let's just talk the entrepreneurial content space that make things seem better than they are, right? Whether it's a pride thing or they have to sell a dream or whatever it is. And you never did that. And no. I know, I don't really know anybody in this space that can't say they respect you for that, because you called it like it was. And look what happened. I think that when you bring out legitimate content and you call it like it is, you can get a pretty big following of fans, which happened. So you started, I had no idea that was the history of AMPM was a lead magnet for, the Helium 10 was a lead magnet for the podcast. Really crazy. And since then, you've done almost 200 episodes of AMPM. It obviously got to be really big. We'll talk about that more later in the episode, places where I've seen it referenced that you probably never would have guessed. Right. And then, Helium 10 is obviously blown up right now. I think it's perfectly okay to say that it is the most used piece of Amazon software in the space, right? Like that's a huge accomplishment. So things have changed in the last few years, right? But looking at the history of all this, starting with the AMPM podcast, what is one of the most surprising things that you noticed come out of the AMPM podcast? Like when it got rolling, what are one of the things that just surprised you the most? I would say probably the doors that it opened. When you have a podcast, one of the things I noticed right away is I could immediately reach out to the CEOs of just about any company in the space or that's somewhat related to the space, and I can get a call, I can get a meeting. I thought that was cool. I remember back then, I was in awe of all the big guys. I remember, Amazing was out there and they had, their events and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, oh man, the owner, that would be cool to meet that guy, and reached out to him and immediately just got an audience and was able to talk to him, and he said, hey, you want to speak, that kind of thing. That was really cool. And I mentioned that on the podcast. I said, guys, if you want to be able to open up the doors and be able to get into so many different, basically get an audience with somebody, write a book or get a podcast or do something. Back when I started the podcast, there really weren't many podcasts related to this space. There was, Scott Volker, he had his podcast, which I was learning from. I've given him credit on a lot of my episodes, but that's about it. But his was about small little things like, here's how to make $100 a month kind of thing. And I was like, here, my thing was, let's follow this journey and see if I can create enough net income to actually support myself, where you don't have to have another job. And that was one of the things you mentioned, that legitimacy and telling it how it is. I was calling BS on a lot of people because they'd come in and they're like, yeah, I got a 65% margins. And I'm like, how are you getting 65% margins when you factor in all the things that we know are out there, right? It just didn't make sense. I'm like, okay, maybe somehow you have something, but explain it to us. So yeah, that's how we started it. That's how we did. And it led into, I think with Helium 10 and with the podcast, and I'm expanding on what you asked, it surprised me how quickly we could grow everything else, because once you have that audience, we were able to create a Facebook group, which quickly grew to become one of the the largest Facebook groups. And from there, we were able to create very high-end, expensive, I guess you would say, live events. And then from there, we got training software. So as it evolved, we just kept coming out with more and more things, and it all stemmed from that. Right. So looking back, almost 200 episodes, who are some of your favorite guests that you ever hosted on the podcast? Man, we've had just about everybody in the industry on the podcast. So I think I
rarely, I think, ever had a guest that I didn't think was pretty awesome. I mean, I had a lot of new guests that I didn't know anything about, that I would just give a shot, like, hey, I don't know that much about you. I've heard good things about you. And then they turn out to be somebody really cool. You were one of them, for example. I didn't know you. I didn't know anything about you. You came on the podcast, and you were one of, I think there's 2 or 3 people that really, like, when you guys came on the podcast, it created a lot of comments, a lot of, like, people are like, you got to do another episode. You got to do 3 episodes with this guy. You were one of them. Kevin King was the first guy. He came on before you. Kevin King, nobody knew who he was, right? And it was hard to get him to come on the podcast because he didn't want to be in the limelight. He had no Facebook friends, 0.
Man,
like,
things have changed since then, haven't they?
Right? Yeah, he refused. He's like, I don't want to be famous. And I'm like, dude, you got something really cool here. Let's talk about it. And so people really love that one. But yeah, I mean, and I think that goes to show how being a really good, or bringing really good content onto a podcast like you did, and now you're working with Helium 10 on stuff. You've taken over the AMPM podcast. There's been a ton of opportunities that open up to you. Same thing with Kevin. When Kevin came on, we did some more stuff. Then we decided to partner up, and we were doing back then the Illuminati Mastermind, and then we started doing training and events and all kinds of stuff. And I think that those were those people, man. There's so many, but you two right now, because we're working with you guys with so many things, they stand out heavily.
Gotcha.
Yeah, you guys, everybody listening around, you're gonna love. If you haven't listened to Tim Jordan's podcast on the AMPM podcast, go and do a search for it, because all the stuff that you talked about back then is still relevant. I would say most of it is still relevant. It's really good stuff.
Yeah, stuff that I talked about. Literally, we just dropped in Project X, and people are still going, "Oh my gosh, this is cutting edge."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's stuff that, like, it doesn't need a hack or you're not gaming the system. It's just legitimate business, right? Which is pretty cool. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So the podcast stopped almost a little over a year ago. AMPM, it just stopped. There was no sayonara. There was no explanation. It just kind of faded off, and Serious Sellers took over. Now we know that Serious Sellers was to be more focused to Amazon selling. We know that. You've already mentioned that. Bradley Sutton took over. Great dude. I've gotten to work with him a ton. We've gotten to be good friends. And man, he hammers deep. Like, people have asked me in preparation for AMPM, like, Tim, what are you going to do differently? And one of the things, like, I'm not going to get as technically detailed as Bradley is on how to do this keyword algorithm fluctuation tracking. Like, that's not how I operate. And he's awesome at that. But there's also another reason that you started getting out of the podcast space. It's because you had some pretty big changes coming up in life. Do you want to, I guess for the first time on public record, kind of explain what you've been going through in the past year?
We'll start with, we're transitioning. I wanted, at some point in a SaaS company, software company, right, as a service, so you're looking towards the future, right? What does the future hold for the company? When are you going to go public? Are you going to sell? Are you going to bring on investors? What are you going to do? And I had realized very, very early on, I'm like, man, I'm starting to become the brand for the company, like me, my face, my voice. I'm doing the ads. I was doing everything. And that makes it very difficult to ever exit a company, right? You're stuck. And it also actually hurts your valuation, because any company that's coming in that's looking at this is going to be saying, hey, if something happens to you, it kind of goes bad, right? So I decided that I needed to start transitioning myself out of the podcast, out of the ads, and which is weird because there's still ads of me running on YouTube and all that stuff from like 2 years ago. But from that point on, we were growing like crazy. Serious Seller podcast was taking off. It was really good. And then we had interest, a lot of interest actually, from companies that wanted to come in and invest and acquire and do all kinds of stuff. So last year, we ended up finally exiting the company, myself and Guillermo. We partnered up with a company, an amazing company called Assembly, and they brought in an amazing team to help already boost our amazing team. And so there was a big transition period there where I was going through all this new stuff with the company, and it just took up all of my time. And now I advise, and life's quite a bit different, from the day-to-day, grind, I guess you would call it, whatever it is. I love doing that stuff, so it wasn't really a grind. But the day-to-day operations, and that's where we're at now. So I said it, so you guys now know Manny and Guy have exited to some extent. We still have we're still involved with the company, and it's awesome. Love it.
But for all intents and purposes, you are not in the office. You are out of the day-to-day operations, and
yes,
you've kind of let some bigger fish come in and start, I don't know, adding some fuel to the fire to keep growing this thing out, which is really exciting. And I remember when you made a Facebook post, you said, "Hey, it's something about moving to Austin." You're like, "Hey, I'm living in SoCal. I want to go to Austin. Does anybody have any suggestions?" or something like that. I remember seeing that post, and I said, "That son of a gun is moving because he's going to sell." I remember thinking that, because the only reason you do that is for, the capital gains tax advantages and all that stuff. And I was like, man, I bet that's going to happen. And of course, nobody knew anything for a long time. And then the Serious Seller podcast thing, really a lot of fuel was put on that fire, and it started taking off. And I saw you start to pull out a little bit. And every time because me and you have hung out a lot in person, we'd hang out and I'd kind of mention stuff, and you'd kind of, I don't know what's going to happen. And, but that's been really cool for me to watch, because those that are listening to this podcast, those that are Amazon sellers, we're not all just Amazon sellers. We're entrepreneurs, right? And finding ways to make money, finding ways to live that, passion and have fulfillment in life, can come in a lot of different ways. I know a lot of people that sell on Amazon that's not their only gig. And for me, Manny, kind of watching you, like, you've got your Amazon business, but like the whole other side of you is building an audience through the podcast and the Facebook groups. And then a whole nother project for you was building Helium 10. And for you, like, being able to move towards this exit from the operations day-to-day of Helium 10 wasn't like, oh, Manny's leaving. It's like, oh my gosh, he's doing it there too. Like, he's a successful Amazon seller, and he's a successful software SaaS business developer. Like, and that was so cool. And I also remember, watching from the outside, Helium 10 getting really, really big. And I felt like you and Guy were just doing everything, and just weighing down. And that's part of the natural evolution of any business. I understand that. So I remember getting really excited thinking about, hey, whatever is next for Helium 10. Whoever comes in, whatever happens with ownership, whatever happens with investors, I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, I'm excited to see it, because I know that Manny and Guy aren't going to let this thing take a dip. Like, any decision they make is going to be for the benefit of the company, for the benefit of the employees, which is a huge part, the team. And over the past year, we've seen nothing but just ridiculous growth with the company, whether it's free content, whether it's tools, whether it's just helping the industry. So that's been a lot of fun, a lot of fun to watch. So now that you've officially said it, this is the first public realm when you've said, hey, we've exited. I got to know what's next. And you and I have never had this conversation until right now, but I got it because, I picture you're in Austin, right? You've got a smaller house than Kevin's. Kevin tells me that all the time. Kevin King brags about his penthouse, but I can't imagine you're the kind of guy that just sits in there drinking tequila and watching Netflix. There's got to be something else on the front burner now that is going to be the new evolution of Manny Coates.
Yeah. So I'm in Austin. So is Kevin King. Kevin King. I'm in an apartment. I'm in a skyrise here. We overlook the city, and he ended up getting, a penthouse or something at another building. And I'm like, oh, darn you got a bigger place.
He tells me all the time, he's like, yeah, man, he's right down the road, but I'm higher and bigger.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he's got an amazing place, for sure. So now, I'm still, I still have an advisory role with Helium 10. I still have interest in the company, right? I want to help them grow. It's going to be an amazing ride for the next, however many years, right? Because you're right, we keep adding new things. One of the things that Guy and I wanted to set up, to make sure that the new management team really can kill it is, first of all, we want to have a really cool office. We want to make sure that people really like coming to the office. So we ended up spending crazy amounts of money to make, our headquarters. This is pre-COVID, right? When everybody was excited to come to the office and look at everything. And we had, you've been there. It's a really cool place. And we almost outgrew it right away because we were hiring so much. The next thing we want to do, obviously we wanted to put out tons of information, right? Our content level is like crazy compared to anybody else. It's just the number of articles that we put out, the free content we put out, the number of podcasts that we put out. Then we started saying, well, everybody's paying for all this training everywhere. What if we put out really, really good training? So that's when we partnered up with Kevin King on this. He was selling, his training for $1,500, and we're just like, and I think it got reduced. There was specials and stuff for $997, and we're like, what if we just include that with Helium 10? Right? Nobody's done that, so we did that. Then we talked to you and Bradley. You guys had that idea for additional content, and we're like, okay, this is. Have you guys ever? Well, you haven't talked about that. You should probably bring that up a little bit. And that's the Project X was just an amazing thing. Like you guys, I feel like that's better than a lot of the courses that are out there. So that's available now. We just kept going, and I think now the management team and Assembly's bringing in some really good people that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. Just because of their deep roots, all the people that they can reach. And then with Boyan and Ryan and all those guys heading up the company, I think it's going to be amazing. I think you're going to see, I feel like it's a pretty, Helium 10's a pretty dominant player in the space now. And I just think it's going to just solidify. It's just going to be like, you don't need to go anywhere. That was one of the things, if I go back to the beginning of the Helium 10, the reason we were so successful with it, I think one of the reasons at least, was that back then I had to go everywhere. I had to go over to this company to do keyword research, and over here to do analytics on this, and over here to do optimization. If I want to do index checking, I had to go over here, right? We had everything in one place. So it's just nice. Like I go here and I can just import everything to the next tool and the next tool. Now a lot of companies are doing that, but we were, I believe, as far as I know, we're the first company to actually do that at scale with a lot of tools.
And that's not slowing down either. I get to see a little bit into the belly of the beast, and man, some of the stuff that's coming is pretty amazing, pretty ridiculous, and still groundbreaking, and still focus on content. So much content. Project X, like you said, was awesome. 100% free YouTube. And I still get, no joke, I probably get 15 private Facebook messages a week from random strangers from all over the world, just saying, "Hey, thanks for guys putting this out. Like this is awesome." And that's all. That's all Helium 10. That's not me.
What would be your 30-second explanation of what Project X is in case people have never heard it? Because it is really, really, really good.
So Project X was, Manny, it was me and you sitting around, and we kind of had the idea, like, let's do a case study now. Because other people had done case studies selling on Amazon 4 or 5 years ago, when you could, the analogy I always use is, in 2016, you could have sold a brown paper bag full of freeze-dried cat poop, for whatever price you wanted. Like, it was so easy to sell anything. Now it's tough. So literally in 2019, 2020, we did another case study of, how to find products away from Amazon, how to use information from all over the place to find products that are in demand with little to no competition on Amazon that you don't have to beat the system. And these aren't huge volume items, they kind of fly under the radar. You don't have hijackers, you don't have those problems. And we literally walked through every step, and we brought some ideas to the table that were not brand new in the industry, but they'd never been shared publicly before. And I think, we launched that just a few months ago, and we've got like 40,000 people that have watched this thing. And it's all free on YouTube. So you guys go and check that out. That was one of the more fun projects that I've ever done in my life. It was so much more work than people can imagine. It took forever. I actually heard someone talking crap about me and Bradley in a fairly public audience, saying, "Oh, this was all rigged because Tim was talking about this back in October, and the stuff didn't even air till January." I'm like, well, yeah, because it took us 6 months to film this thing. Like, we were filming this last summer, even though, the episodes didn't release till January, and I had no idea it would take that much work, that much time, but it was definitely worth it.
Yeah, and it's also, I remember we were talking about this. We were talking about that, can we release it really, really quickly? But then you run into the problem where, and this is unfortunate with any industry you get into, as soon as you put something out there and you're like, hey, we're getting some traction with this product, and it's part of a case study, then you have 100 people that jump into that product, and it messes up the whole case study, right? So you gotta wait a little bit. So by the time you guys released, I think everything was finished and it was good. And the price is great, right? On that Project X, what's it cost again?
It's free.
It's free. Yeah, I know. And don't let anybody listening right now, don't let the free price tag make you think that it's not good. Honestly, it's better than a lot of the $1,000 packages that you're going to buy out there. They go really, really, really deep. So it's really awesome. So congratulations on that. It came out better than I expected.
I'm glad to see you had low expectations.
I didn't have looks. I had high expectations, but it came out better than that. It was really good. The quality was good. The content was good. The production value was really good. I mean, everything was good. You were flying in. It was nice.
And it worked. And that is still making consistent money every month. I don't know whose paycheck that's paying, but it's still money, which is great.
I think they just added it. Well, you probably know better than I do because I'm not handling the day-to-day stuff. But they didn't they just move Project X into Helium 10 like now as part of like I think it's in one of the pages there.
I honestly have no clue. I have no idea. I kind of
they've done it or they're about to do it. So the people that are going in, I think it's in your Freedom Ticket section. So part of Helium 10, you now get the $1,000 course included with Helium 10, and somewhere in there's also the Project X. So you get Freedom Ticket and you get Project X, and I think there's some other stuff in there now too. So it's really cool. It's just an unbeatable deal for anybody starting. We wanted to really give back to the audience out there. Like, if you're going to spend $97 with us, we want you to be a member for as long as possible. Hopefully we're giving you all the tools that you need to be successful so that you can continue to be a customer of ours and you can go on the podcast later on and talk about your success and all that. If you just put out software and people fail after 30 days, kind of sucks. But if you can give them the tools to actually get good and learn things right, then I think that's the way to make a business work. Tell us a little bit about, more about yourself, how you got into the e-commerce space, why you came on the podcast, and why you're here now. Because you're taking this thing over. You're going to be doing all the episodes from now, and you're going to be focusing on the e-commerce entrepreneurial side of things. So I know there's like 4 questions in one, but I wanted to give you some runway here. Why don't you take it from here?
All right, and if I if I miss one, just pause me and I'll come back to it. But yeah, e-commerce for me started off by accident. I was never techie. I was never exceptionally smart and thought I'd be an engineer or a software guy or anything like that. In college, I decided to pursue firefighting, of all things. Just kind of, I wanted that as an adventure. I thought it'd be cool. So moved down to Huntsville, Alabama, and got hired on as a firefighter. There's like 2,500 applicants and 25 hires. So I felt, really blessed to have this amazing job. And firefighters work a 24-hour shift. So we'd work 24 hours and be off for 48. So we worked 2 days a week. So we all had side jobs, and I'm an entrepreneur by heart. In middle school, I was out doing some side hustle and stuff like that, and always worked 2 or 3 jobs. But I started construction companies. I had all sorts of crazy stuff going on that never really went well. It sucked, actually. Yeah, at one point, I thought I was doing awesome. I was 23 years old. I had a construction company with tons of employees, and I was responsible for like 78 tires, between all the trucks and trailers. I don't know how this equipment, but I wasn't making any money. I was doing millions of dollars of sales a year, and I wasn't making any money. And I kept going kind of from one thing to the next. But I ended up having a buddy who is in the government procurement business. Have you seen the movie War Dogs?
Yes.
The guys that are like running guns to Afghanistan, and they're these hustlers like bidding on government stuff. Well, that was me, but not with weapons and not to the military. So it was State Department, but I was selling dump truck tires and diesel generators and, like lock sets for doors. And we were shipping it to like embassies and consulates all over the world. So I literally, as a part-time job, was doing international procurement, sourcing, logistics, and like really high-level government sales. And I got pretty stinking good at it. And I ended up making some really big deals. I was involved with a startup company in Africa, like Kenya, selling construction equipment, like all sorts of crazy stuff that for a 20-something-year-old I had no business doing, like biting off way more than I could chew, but somehow figuring out how to swallow it, right? And one day I'm looking at, I'm trying to source these oil filters, right, for big diesel generators. And I'm looking online, and like I see on Amazon, these are $29.99. And my wholesale cost from the manufacturer is like $7. I'm thinking, man, like because of the volume, we get such a great discount through these manufacturers for like Cummins diesel parts. There's got to be a way to sell these things. So I literally put a Craigslist ad up, and I said, can someone teach me how to sell on eBay? Because I didn't even know you can sell on Amazon. I had no idea. And
right, most people didn't, yeah.
Yeah, and I had no idea. And I'm expecting like some college kid to answer this ad. Well, I get this guy to answer it, and I said, well, come meet us at the warehouse, the office. And this like 60-year-old bald dude walks in, and I'm like, wow, this is my eBay guy. So he starts looking at the catalog, and he starts looking at stuff, and he's like, you need to sell on Amazon. And he got me started down this journey, and selling wholesale. And then I quickly got into this private label thing. I was listening to content like AMPM at the time. And I remember listening, like the first webinar I ever watched was Scott Volker. You'd mentioned him. And just learning really, really fast, and got into private label, screwed up a ton. I mean, I'm looking like at the other side of the camera at my desk of all these failed products that I've tried to sell. I tried to get into Moscow Mule mugs, and they were super saturated, and car hammers and meat tenderizers and hooded baby towels and all the crap you don't, like the wrong stuff to sell, right? But in the midst of that, I was launching very successful golf cart accessories and automotive parts, that space. And then I got into like weird random accessories and stuff, and it blew up. And it was still a side business for me. It was actually a second side business for me. I was still a firefighter. I was still doing the government procurement, and I was still managing the procurement and logistics for the business in Africa. And then, so my third or fourth side hustle was Amazon. And we hit $1 million in sales in our first 7 months. And we just kept launching private label after private label. I started going to China regularly and figuring out like how to source directly. I started hitting up big markets like Yiwu and Canton Fair and making connections, and it went crazy. And in about 2 years ago, I was able to walk away from my job as a firefighter, which was great. I was traveling all the time for, Amazon e-commerce related stuff anyways, and just having more time to spend at home every third night. I got to stay at home and stay with the kids was awesome. But you were asking about like how I got started in the public realm, right? And I don't even know if you remember this, but do you remember how you and I first came in contact with each other?
I don't. I was just trying to think about that. I remember at the time I had somebody that was setting up my guests. So no, remind me.
Yeah. So I had always had this passion for developing countries. I now know not to call them third world countries, but developing countries. Right now, you remember.
I remember.
And,
I remember.
I was doing stuff in Honduras and Haiti and all these places, and I actually want to start sourcing products in Central America, fair wage, fair trade products that could be sold on Amazon. So I started a sourcing company in Guatemala. And that sourcing company, I hired local staff there to run it, and would work with these small family artisans to find, products and get it made. In fact, back here, one of my props that Mika approved. This is kind of special to me. It's a ball of cotton, cotton thread that was hand-dyed, hand-woven in San Juan La Laguna, Guatemala, by a co-op of women, The reason this is special to me is I bought it for about $4, but I have watched the way it's made. They grow the cotton, they pick it by hand, they spin it into thread, they dye it with like plant-based. This is 40 man hours of labor.
Wow.
And I bought it for like $4. And like, it reminds me like, hey, when I think I'm having a bad day, or I think that like my Amazon products aren't making enough money or something's 40 hours for $4, right? So,
yeah.
So anyways, you had posted something in one of the Facebook groups. Hey, I need someone to source something in Central America. And I said, oh, funny, I've got that set up. And you and I messaged on Facebook Messenger, and I kind of told you who I was, what I was doing. You're like, oh, this would be great for AMPM podcast. And you brought me onto the episode, and we actually didn't talk at all about sourcing in Central America. We just started riffing about my ideas about how to get product ideas and how to build businesses and how to generate. And we went for like 50 minutes and never even touched on the Central America thing. It never happened. But that was actually a really interesting experience for me, because it was the first time I was ever interviewed for anything. And I remember you asked me that, and I'm like, sure, I'll be in a podcast. And crap, how do I be on a podcast? I don't even know what this means. And this is back in like 2017. And I remember thinking, all right, I have to get like a microphone, right? So I got on Amazon. I didn't want to spend much money, but I bought a $30 microphone. And I remember I had it shipped to the warehouse where I was working. One of my employees, Tabby, shout out to you. She made so much fun of me. She's like, oh my God, you're one of those guys that has to get a podcast microphone now. And I'm like, yeah, I'm being interviewed. And what's actually crazy is that's it right there. That's the podcast microphone I bought. I had it laying on my desk, and Mika, we were setting up the studio. She's like, you got to put that up there. So that's the $30 podcast mic I bought for the AMPM interview. And anyways, the interview went awesome. I remember we talked for a long time just about all sorts of stuff. And then I think that was like November of 2017. I think later you told me it was like the second or third most listened to podcast of the entire year, and it came out in November. And I was kind of taken back by that. So at the time, I had also started a sourcing and shipping company out of China. I had warehouse and FBA prep in the U.S., and things just started blowing up. Other people started contacting me for content, for collaborations, for sourcing and shipping, which I don't do anymore. By the way, I sold that company. So if you guys want sourcing or shipping, I'm not your guy. But really, honestly, and I know it sounds kind of cheesy and nostalgic, but like, the reason that I'm taking over the AMPM podcast now is because I got started with my very first piece of information that I ever gave out publicly on the AMPM podcast. So for me, it's kind of special. It's like, you know, where everything began for me in a public role, and now it's
that's
like,
an awesome
crazy,
story.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I remember, there was so many people that liked it and that's why I keep telling people to go back and listen to it. Maybe some of the content now people will be like, oh yeah, I already know that. But back then it was awesome. Everybody was loving it. And you went from not having done a podcast to suddenly, I remember you contacted me going, holy crap, dude, like I'm getting contacted. Like, I remember how many times a day now people were inquiring like, hey, can you help me do this? Can you do that? And I was like, see, this is what happens. You get on the right play, the right stage, and then people will come, right? They'll come after you. And I just remember from that point on, you just like a rocket ship, you took off. I saw you getting into everything. You were everywhere. You were speaking, you were doing all kinds of stuff. And you became the guy that, like, if I had a question about something going on in the industry, I'd be like, I got to call up, I got to call Tim and see what's going on here. Because somehow you have ears everywhere. It's awesome. So I think that's perfect for this kind of a podcast, because first of all, you're a good interviewer. You know everybody. You know so much. You can pivot so easily on a bunch of different things. And I think it doesn't always have to be about, I don't know, for us, I started with the Amazon stuff, Amazon private label, and then we slowly pivoted to about 6-7 different things, but we brought it all together, right? And I think you can do a great job with this and all the businesses that you're involved in. So yeah, do you think anybody remembers you from that episode?
So, there was a first big push, and then we had a second episode, like maybe a year later, you interviewed me again, but I had kind of forgotten about the first episode. And oddly enough, last year I was in Australia, and I was speaking and doing a workshop at an event called Retail Global, and pretty big event there in Australia. And I was put together in this, they called it Amazon Injection Lab, where they had Amazon employees and Amazon experts in a workshop where you could sign up and have 15 minutes of consultation, right? Specifically for people that are trying to get started. And there's another coach there, a guy named Chris Thomas. Chris runs the Australian Sellers podcast, right? And I'd never met him before. I'm shaking hands and we're talking, and he's kind of overhearing me from across the booth, talking to somebody else. And I think I was talking about Pinterest. And he's like, he said, what you're talking about has really changed how I've done my business and how I find products. He said, it's great stuff. He said, it's interesting. He said, the first time I heard about that was like a few years ago. Some nut job brought this idea up on a podcast and was explaining it. And he's like, I thought it was a little bit crazy at first, but it still kind of made sense. And I started doing it and it works. Now I've got these products that I found this way. I'm like, really awesome. I'm like, what podcast was he? Like, man, I can't remember, but I've got it saved. And like, he goes, and I don't know, whatever podcast platform, and he's like scrolling on his cell phone. After coming in, he's like, oh, here it is. And he hits the button, and Manny, it was me and you. and he didn't realize it. And he was like, what? And he looks at me and then he hears the voice and he looks, he's like, oh, this is Tim Jordan. I'm like, well, I'm Tim Jordan. Here I am.
Yeah.
So literally,
that job.
This is like, I'm that crazy guy. So literally years later, some dude who doesn't even make the connection is still talking about that on literally the other side of the world. So that was kind of a shock to me, because I was like, man, it was kind of motivating. Like, you have to put out good content that works for you, and you can't hide stuff. Like, I hate this mentality of, oh, I found something that works, we've got to hide it. Because even when we talk about good stuff, there's so much opportunity out there. I've had people even recently tell me, hey, Tim, there's certain things that you're doing to find products you shouldn't talk about publicly because other people are going to copy you. And I'm like, who cares? Like, other people are doing it. I might as well talk about it publicly and help as many people as we can, because it's not going to stay secret forever. And the things that I'm talking about aren't short-lived. Like, these are basic principles that don't have a ceiling. It's not like, some hack that once, 10,000 people do it, it wipes out. No, it's like, if we're doing the basic things like finding something in demand with low competition, taking it to a new platform, like fulfilling a need to a customer base. This is completely Amazon agnostic. Like, it doesn't matter what platform you're selling on. Like, this is basic common sense business. And that's what I was talking about. And
Yeah.
it was crazy just to know that first episode was still being talked about years later on the other side of the world. Kind of gave me a realization that, hey, this AM PM thing is a pretty big deal. And then, like that popped into my mind, a couple months ago when Boyan kind of brought this up and said, hey, Tim, we want you to host it. So it's crazy how all that kind of came full circle.
That's awesome. So since AM/PM podcast is coming full circle, you're talking about putting out a lot of content. You got a lot of ideas. Let's talk about or let me just ask you, what do you think people can expect, or what are the changes that are coming to the AM/PM podcast now that you're going to be taking it over?
Well, there has to be a division between Serious Seller Podcast and AM/PM Podcast, right? Because when AM/PM started, it was a little bit of everything. It was a lot of Amazon. It was a lot of entrepreneurial growth, like the journey. It was fulfilling a lot of needs. And then Serious Sellers Podcast from Bradley has kind of done the same thing, but it's more leaned towards serious selling, like more Amazon specific, right? So what I thought would be a great idea when I kind of discussed this with the powers to be was, hey, there is a need for other entrepreneurial stuff seen from the eyes of an e-commerce seller or an Amazon seller, right? And like I have I'm involved in a lot of communities. I do a lot of consulting. I have a coaching group, a coaching program where I get to talk to my students, every week. And like, there's a common theme of Amazon's not it. Amazon's great. Amazon's wonderful, but we also need to be thinking about away from Amazon or addition to Amazon or even additional revenue streams. Like right now, COVID is not a good time to be doing it, but 6 months ago, these Amazon sellers were going to do investment properties and Airbnb. And like, I realized that the Amazon community represents a much larger entrepreneurial demand. Everybody wants something. And the truth is, we don't always know what's going to be best for us. There are people that have this like drive to become an entrepreneur, and they hear a podcast, they see a course or webinar, and they decide to start selling on Amazon, and it's not for them, right? It's not a get rich quick scheme. It's not automated. It's not super simple. And sometimes it's not for them. But when they get started down that journey to do something else, I know people that were incredible, entrepreneurs, horrible Amazon sellers, but by getting that space, they ended up launching amazing shipping companies and 3PLs and software companies. Like, you have to start down this journey. So what I decided was AM/PM needs to be a space for all of that. Like, let's talk about entrepreneurship. Let's talk about running a business. Let's talk about growth. Let's talk about crazy stuff like mental health from an entrepreneur standpoint, like some stuff that I've struggled with and experienced recently. Like, nobody's freaking talking about it. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to talk about amazing listing optimization or, too much on how to find the right product. Let's talk about like how we become better entrepreneurs, like how we find the correct approach to make money in the AM and the PM, like these residual income streams, these automated, like fire your boss, quit your 9 to 5 when it's time. I'm not advocating like quit your job, buy this course and become a millionaire next week. That doesn't happen. It's not realistic. And I know there's a lot of those podcasts, a lot of information out there, but there's none specifically from the Amazon seller community. Like, those of us that are e-commerce sellers or Amazon sellers in a broader sense, forget that we're also e-commerce sellers, right? Like, we're not product seller, or we're not Amazon sellers, we're product sellers. And if we think of ourselves as product sellers, then we can be sellers across other platforms. Like, there's amazing opportunities to get into brick and mortar for the right brands. There's amazing opportunities to start driving your own traffic with Shopify sites or funnels or subscription boxes, or, I know people that are killing it on like Etsy and all these other, other platforms internationally. Amazon sucks in some countries, but there are huge growing marketplaces. I think, and look, I could be wrong, but I think that the U.S. market is ripe for a big Amazon competitor, right? Amazon's dominating it all, but they're not doing it all right. And I think that especially as the government's starting to step back and say like, whoa, Amazon's getting a little too powerful, and like they're getting in trouble for stealing private label or suppliers directly compete against them. Like, I think in 3 years from now, there's going to be a huge competitor to Amazon. And I want AM/PM to be like the first place that's talking about those other opportunities. Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe it's really ambitious, but I want to go really, really wide. I definitely think the focus will still be on e-commerce because we're coming from e-commerce, but we're going to be talking about other platforms, other business ventures, other ideas, other thoughts, other motivation, other struggles. We're going to hear stories, successes and failures. We're going to see other examples of what's working and what's not. We're just going to get in all sorts of crazy stuff, and it's awesome. Earlier today I was looking at the lineup of all the future speakers we have, and they're people that like I never would have imagined I'd get to interview. And they're like, yes, we want to come on the AMPM podcast and like drop some gold. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Can you maybe you can't, but are you able to hint at what's coming in the next episode? Does that have to be secret?
Well, things could change, but we've got some big folks. You know, we're not talking Tony Robbins yet. We'll get to there eventually, but we've got some big guys. We've got like one of the first episodes I have on the first 5. We're actually going to be talking to. I love this. Most of you have never seen her publicly. She's a very successful Amazon seller whose life changed on 9/11. Like, I won't get too much in the story, but like it makes me want to cry thinking about it. But like, her story is incredible. We're gonna talk to one of the more influential people I've had in my life, who actually led me to start that business in Guatemala, and like what he's like. He posted a Facebook picture the other day where he is during this COVID thing, you know, like these developing countries, underdeveloped countries are starving, you know, because they rely on tourism and nobody's flying, and like they're all stranded too. And like he's buying semi-truck loads of like melons to deliver to these neighborhoods, and like, you know, these very, very poor, like some just incredible people. We've got episode 200. So this is episode 195. Episode 200 is going to be a multi-Grammy award-winning musician who completely stepped out of that and now runs a company manufacturing leather products in Haiti. Like, they bought a resort and are employing like 100 artisans making products for brands in the US. Like incredible stuff, right? So we're going to get really, really deep. Those are just some of the first few coming out, and you guys are going to. I think those of you that are listening are really going to enjoy it.
That's awesome. So next year, next 2 years, where do you see this thing going? I mean, you've already covered quite a bit. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think that for one, we're going to be following closely the upcoming changes that are coming with e-commerce, right? New opportunities opening up. I think that obviously this is going to keep growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't want to put like a target in a year and say, this is where we're going to be, because the thing about e-commerce that I've learned is like, you can't speculate. Like you cannot anticipate. You cannot guess what's going to happen. Like, you have to be flexible. You have to be nimble. And that's why, to me, like, e-commerce entrepreneurship is so powerful, is because when big brands and big companies and big corporations are stuck in these archaic, like giant, slow turning ships trying to adjust to the market, like, we can turn on a freaking dime. We can make a decision right now, pivot our business, and be off to the races like at the first opportunity that pops up. Right. And because this whole podcast, this whole, you know, message and this whole group of content is for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs, I want to make sure that I'm not targeting us in any way that's less flexible, right? So I want to make sure that the newest thing that pops up, the newest idea, the newest content, the newest theories even are going to pop up. But I will say this, for those of you listening, like, there's a lot of people that have and listen, I've had a podcast. Excuse me. Listen, I've had a podcast, and podcasts are really hard to get going because there's so many of them out there. But we have like the backing of a lot of talented team members, like all of you that help pull this off. It's incredible. I was in a Zoom meeting getting this plan the other day, and I took a screenshot. It's like 16 people that are helping pull this off. So AMPM has the muscle, the brawn, the brain power behind it to do some incredible things. And I can't even fathom what it's going to be like in a year or two from now, because we have so many resources pulling the most awesome content, relevant content, best interviewees, you know, all focused on an e-commerce seller that wants to grow and wants to expand, right? Or an entrepreneur that even wants to get into e-commerce. So we're going to talk a lot about that. And maybe this is going to step on some toes. I just want to make this very clear right now. When I agreed to do this podcast, I did it under the, how do I say this diplomatically? I did it with the understanding that I would be allowed to treat this independently from Helium 10. All right. So what I mean by that is, this is not going to be a massive sales pitch. You know, Helium 10 still owns the podcast. They're the ones that do all the back end work for me, but I'm in my office in Alabama. Like, this is AMPM. So we're going to be, you know, not giving constant sales pitches for one thing or the other. You know, this is a little bit independent, which is, to me, makes it more powerful. I'm going to be interviewing people that have not always been friends of Helium 10 in the past. I'm trying to interview even competitors of Helium 10, because I think the content they bring is so powerful. And I so strongly believe that the e-commerce community is better when we work together. Like, you know, an analogy that I heard someone tell me once is like, all these service providers in the e-commerce space, whether it's shippers or software companies, or whatever, like we're all fighting for a bigger piece of the pizza. When if we would just open our freaking eyes and realize that if we work together, we just build a bigger dang pizza, right? Because like we live in e-commerce and like we know about selling on Amazon. But if I walked outside of my office to the offices next door and said something out, hey, do you know you could sell on Amazon? They have no clue. Like the sky is a limit for e-commerce sellers because nobody knows it's out there as for service providers, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And like now with COVID happening, like we're airing this right in the middle of the COVID, you know, we're trying to get out of quarantine, but who knows what's going to happen in 2020. Like on all these other industries are tanking, which is sad. It's brutal. It's heartbreaking. Like the truth is, this is proven that e-commerce is the future, right?
Yeah.
People that never even knew about e-commerce, like my old cranky father-in-law who would never buy anything online, he was forced to. Now he realizes how amazing it is, and he'll probably never go to an auto parts store again. It's all on Amazon or eBay, right? So I don't know. There's some, I would say even a little bit of controversial, you know, a little bit of controversy might be coming because, you know, AMPM has been so closely with Helium 10, and if we're going to do this right, we have to take politics out of it. And you know, I've even gotten special permission to interview some people, like I said, that haven't always been friends to the Helium 10 brand, but are friends to the e-commerce community. So some pretty cool stuff coming.
Sounds good. What's the publishing schedule going to look like? How often are you putting out an episode?
So this week we're dropping 3, you know, this first week, and then we're dropping 1 a week every Thursday is the plan. So every Thursday. And we've got other content that's not just going to be published on the podcast. Check out the AMPM Facebook page, Instagram page, ampm.com, ampmpodcast.com. We've got written blogs for it. Like we're just going to keep rolling this thing into just a giant content factory that it kind of operates independently a little bit, you know, agnostic to a certain service or a certain influencer, and it's going to be good. I really strongly believe that.
And the intro's changing to you next episode?
Yeah, the intro of this episode, we kind of want to do something kind of fun. I know that the production staff want to do kind of a cool little transition. And yeah, unfortunately, and it's kind of like, maybe it breaks my heart more than it does yours, Manny, but like after this episode, we're not going to see Manny in the AMPM podcast anymore.
Yeah, you know what? It's been an amazing journey, though. It's funny when we talk to people and they're like, "Man, you guys did really well." You know, within about a 4-year period, you were able to take something from bootstrap to exit. And I'm like, time-wise, it was 4 years, but like life force-wise, it was like 8 years because we were putting in.
Years
you know how it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were putting in like, man, there was days where we worked 24 hours straight, but it wasn't unusual to be putting in 16-hour days regularly 6-7 days a week. So I always tell Guillermo, my co-founder and business partner, I'm like, bro, we were putting in double shift. We did 8 years of work in 4 years. So we feel good. We feel proud. Didn't have to take a lot of people. This might be another episode where we could come in and talk a little bit more about this. I'm now starting to get into seed, like angel investing into startups and things like that. It's very interesting going through this process, how you should set up certain companies, things you shouldn't do, things you should do, valuations of companies, right? If you have an Amazon business, you hear this all the time where they're like, you get 2x to 3x your evaluate, in terms of valuation, where other companies could be 5x, 6x, 10x. Why is that? When is a company only 1x? Why would you want to build that kind of thing? So we could talk about that stuff, or you should bring on a guest that's a super pro at that. But this is going to be cool. I'm going to be listening. I'm excited to hear what's coming.
Well, if I suck it up and I don't live up to your expectations, please don't tell me. I have a soft ego. I don't want you to crush my spirits too quick.
It's going to be good. It's going to be good. I want to come to the 200th episode party. Hey, that's only like 6 episodes from now, right?
4
or 5 episodes.
4 episodes, yeah. We'll get you on for the 300th episode. That'll be the plan.
There we go.
But,
perfect.
I'll just say this to close us off. I know it's been a long episode, guys, and we're going to try to keep the other episodes shorter. We just had so much to cram in, and now that Manny's just sitting in Austin drinking tequila and not answering his phone, we had to get him in one call. In fact, no, I'm just kidding. But I'll say this, and I can be sappy. It's okay. It's my podcast now, but Manny, I'll say that what you've done with AMPM has been incredible. Like, forget Helium 10. Let's just talk about AMPM, right? You put this thing together really not knowing what you we're doing, and literally have people on the other side of the world still listening to this thing, even without another episode in a year. Like, we're still getting tens of thousands of views a month, right? And we're just going to grow that. But I don't know anybody that has a bad word to say about you, and that's so hard in this industry. Yeah, it's so hard to do because there's so much just cutthroat backstabbing, you know, and it's not just this industry, it's any industry. And to do that, you had to call it like it was. You had to, you know, be a man of your word, which you've always been, and you've had to, you know, call the shots whether they were pretty or not. You know, you had to pull the cover off some things and call it like it was. And I think you've gained a lot of respect from that. And I appreciate everything you've done for me. You know, personally, I just want to tell you that kind of on the record here. If I didn't have that opportunity to be on that first episode, not only would I not be here, but like I wouldn't have been as successful as a seller, because what people think in the service space is like, oh, you just start doing podcast stuff to sell your service. No, like, one of the reasons I do so many collaborations and I communicate with so many people and I go to every freaking conference out there is to learn myself. Like, this is how you learn. Like, Manny, you learn so much just from interviewing people, right? And
right.
And if I hadn't been invited and you hadn't talked me into coming that first episode, I definitely wouldn't be here. I probably would still be working, you know, my blue collar, you know, firefighter job, which is great, but I'm much happier here. You know, making more money than I ever expected to in my life. You know, get to have, you know, be able to bring my kids up in a scenario and a situation that I never got when I was, you know, a kid, which is, you know, a true blessing for me. And I get to help other people in the industry. So really, you know, I mean it when I say I appreciate everything you've done. And I am one of your biggest fans because you have had such a profound impact on my life. So
that means a lot to me.
And I don't take this lightly, taking over the AM/PM. I feel like this is such a powerful thing, and it's such an important thing to so many people that I take seriously what we're doing, and I'm gonna do my best not to screw this up. And I know the rest of the team that's kind of working behind me is gonna be doing the same. And man, it's been awesome to know you. I can't wait to see you again. I'm sure when all this travel stuff, you know, loosens up, we'll get to hang out. And we've partied once or twice before. I'm sure. Oh, yeah. I'm sure we'll replicate that again one of these days. And,
we have to tell those stories. They're fun. Yeah, I appreciate all that. That means a lot to me, and this has been a really fulfilling journey for me. And just talking to all the people that the podcast has actually helped. So I couldn't be more proud of somebody like you actually taking it over. We talked about you know, who we could have come in and fill the role, and it's been empty for the longest time because there just wasn't somebody that I wanted in there that the company and the team felt would be good. So you're the guy. You're going to take this to the next level. It's going to be a moonshot from here. So I'm super excited. You're going to crush it.
Awesome. You said that, and all I heard was, well, we looked for a year and couldn't find anybody, so we had to resort to Tim.
No, we're being very selective, but yeah, I like how you think. You know what? No, actually, I don't know. It's funny. We're talking now, and I'm learning things as we're talking, but I don't know if people think Manny knows the schedule and who you're going to be chatting with. I don't know any of these things, so it's going to be cool. I'm going to be tuning in. It's going to be great.
Educate you.
And you got a better office for the AM/PM podcast than I do, or than awesome. I did, I guess.
Yep, it's awesome. And
it looks awesome.
If for any of you that are having a little nostalgia, the metal letters. Those metal letters behind me were always behind Manny in his office in the AM/PM, especially the later episodes. And I had someone from the Helium 10 ship me those. They actually snuck into the office in COVID quarantine. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this. And got those things UPS to me so we could have them in the background. So thank you again, Manny. Thank y'all for listening. I know it's been a long episode. Those of you that have been following Manny or following Helium 10, following AM/PM for a long time, you needed this episode. Like, you needed some closure because, you know, for years this thing trudged along and there was no finality. You know, there's no closure. So you've got it now. Thanks for sticking through such a long episode. I promise you the other episodes shouldn't be this long. We'll be a little shorter. Make sure that you help us get this thing off the ground again, because the bigger we make this, the better content we can put out, the better guests we can have on, the more assets we can, you know, push towards the podcast to help you guys out. So make sure to go to the Facebook page, make sure to go to the Instagram page, like all that. Go to the AM/PM podcast website, sign up for the email list. You get notified when we put out new episodes. Go to YouTube. This one is all on video, so we can put on YouTube. Go subscribe to the YouTube channel and all that good stuff. Get connected with us wherever you can. If you're just listening to the podcast, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast, like it on whatever it was, iTunes or Podbean or whatever you're listening to. Make sure you do all of those things and keep up with us, because I promise we're going to bring stuff that's going to help, and it's going to be a lot of fun along the way. So thank y'all for being on. Again, thank you, Manny. We'll sign off, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.